A thick plume of smoke rises from the town square, obscuring the carrion birds circling overhead. Poor souls huddle in abandoned houses and darkened alleyways, desperate to stave off the inevitable. The cries and moans of the dying echo off the cobblestone pavement. A silent horror stalks the streets of this town. Wagon wheels sound a crack, crack against the streets as they bear their cargo onward. Carts littered with corpses carry the monster's victims to the charnel pits and mass graves that have already claimed half of the town. It always begins with a cough, followed by fever, vomiting, and a mysterious loss of blood. Soon, the victim is consumed by the monster and slowly wastes away into a mere shell of their former self. And all that's left behind is death. The rich and the poor, the young and the old, the sinner and the sane, no one is safe from its wrath. The plague has come to town. As long as human civilization has existed, disease and sickness have been our constant companions. Early humanity faced many predators. None was more dangerous and mysterious than disease. For prehistoric humanity, sickness was as common as it was terrible and frightening. All those early human fears gave birth to the many folk tales and myths surrounding diseases and mass epidemics. Demonic possession, occult magic, and monsters of every kind are all connected to this primal human fear of infection and bodily contamination. With the benefit of hindsight, it might be easy to see these tales as mere superstition run amok. But for pre-modern humanity, plagues were biblical events that could decimate the population. And looking back through history, we can see that mass epidemics are often pivotal moments, microscopic invaders powerful enough to bring even an empire to its knees. Now, generally, the word plague is used pretty interchangeably when talking about epidemics and mass outbreaks of disease throughout history. But if we want to get real technical about it, plague is actually a real scientific term in the medical profession. It refers to the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a hardy little bacillus that's responsible for some of the most devastating epidemics of all time. Yersinia pestis is responsible for one of the most severe forms of pneumonia, the pneumonic plague, a bloody respiratory infection which literally devours the lungs of its victim. Left untreated, the pneumonic plague has a mortality rate of 100%. Yersinia pestis also gave birth to the septicemic plague, which is transmitted by bites from infected insects and vermin. Septicemia invades the blood of its victims, hijacking the body's blood clotting mechanism and causing infected areas to rot and decay. And like its cousins, it is completely fatal when left untreated. And finally, Yersinia pestis is the cause of the bubonic plague, which inflicts horrible, painful swellings on the body's sensitive glands in the neck, armpits, and groin. Recurring throughout human history, the bubonic plague has been responsible for some of the most infamous and terrible mass epidemics ever witnessed. The most well-known outbreak of bubonic plague was the Black Death that devastated medieval Europe. but the very first bubonic epidemic ever recorded took place almost an entire millennium before the Black Death on the same continent, the plague of Justinian. By 541 AD, the Roman Empire was well past the height of its imperial glories and had been divided into east and west for more than a century and a half. While the western half of the empire began a slow decline almost immediately after the split, the Eastern Roman Empire thrived, at least for a time. But in 541 AD, scattered reports of mass outbreaks began to reach the court at Constantinople, the grand capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. First, it took Egypt, then Syria, then Turkey, and eventually Constantinople, the threshold between East and West itself. Within the space of only 1 year, an estimated 25 million people lost their lives to the plague of Justinian, about 15% of the world's population at the time. And the disease would go on to double this death toll in flare-ups that would recur over the next 2 centuries. The lightning-fast spread of the plague was surely a cruel and bitter irony for the Romans. The disease was able to spread so quickly precisely because of the empire's highly advanced infrastructure. Highways, aqueducts, and ports proved as effective at transmitting disease as they were at moving people and goods. The enemies of Constantinople took notice of this moment of weakness and were quick to seize the advantage. The Goths... No, not these Goths. These Goths. The Gothic war with the Eastern Roman Empire found new momentum thanks to how badly the plague had weakened Constantinople and its armies. As a result, the empire could no longer maintain control of huge swaths of the Italian peninsula, perhaps the ultimate symbol of how far the legacy of Rome had already fallen. This quirk of history, human interconnectedness as both a strength and ultimate vulnerability, has defined our anxieties around mass disease down through the years. The proverbial building blocks of our civilization could be the very same thing that brings us down. And a good 1,000 years later, this same fatal pandemic would sweep across Europe once more, but this time at an even more terrifying scale. It is hard to overstate the sheer havoc and terror that the Black Death wreaked on Europe and the world. An estimated 50 to 60% of the population of Europe perished, along with some 100 to 200 million people across both Europe and Asia. It took more than 2 centuries for the world's population to recover from the mass casualties caused by the Black Death. Europe was utterly devastated. From Madrid to Moscow, in every town, bodies piled up by the thousands. Plague riots, starvation, and widespread social collapse became regular facts of life. The healers of the time had no explanation for what this disease was, how it spread, or how to prevent it. And with no way of knowing the cause, the kings and lords who ruled this era were powerless to stop it from spreading. A great period of mass unreason gripped Europe, and superstition and dogma ran amok. In turn, peasants and the nobility alike turned to divination, astrology, and religious dogma to try to make sense of this senseless catastrophe. In the wake of this great unraveling, Europe experienced an unprecedented wave of fanaticism and religiously motivated violence. It gave birth to superstitions and bigotries that lingered well into the Renaissance and beyond. Minority groups like Jews and Romani were singled out for persecution in many countries as scapegoats for the plague. And even simple skin conditions like acne and eczema became cause for suspicion and scorn, and for accusations of heresy. Of course, there have also been mass epidemic events that are every bit as epic as the bubonic plague, even if they aren't plagues in the medical sense. The Cocolitzi epidemics of 1545 to 1548 were caused by a viral hemorrhagic fever that is believed to have killed 80% of the native population of Mexico at the time. Some of the worst demographic devastation ever recorded. Coming just a few decades after the bloody and brutal Spanish conquest of Mexico in 1519, the Cocolitzi epidemics were a final killing blow to the region's indigenous peoples. For most of humanity, the fear of a mass outbreak of disease is not even a distant memory. Plagues have persisted well into the modern era. Exactly 1 century ago this year, a strange and deadly new strain of influenza began cropping up around the world. By early 1918, World War I was winding down, the United States had formally entered the war, and the German-Ottoman alliance was crumbling. Mass outbreaks of disease during war were nothing new, but this time, something was different. This new pandemic, dubbed the Spanish flu, was swift, vicious, and deadly. Despite the relatively high quality of medical care available at the time, the Spanish flu still had a staggeringly high mortality rate, up to 20% in some regions. And unlike the pandemics that came before it, the Spanish flu was well and truly global in scale. Europe, Asia, the Americas, the Middle East, Africa. No one was spared its wrath. The onset of the disease was quick, and the symptoms were severe. After infection, a perfectly healthy person could be dead in less than a week. This disease was able to spread at a breakneck pace thanks to the marvels of humanity's new industrial age. World War I is considered a pivotal era in history, a time when the technology of industrial manufacturing was turned to the art of warfare, resulting in mass slaughter on a scale that had never been witnessed before. And those same technologies were also an ideal vector for the spread of a pandemic. Soldiers moved across battlefields in massive troop formations by truck and train, spreading disease to the living and dead alike. Food was scarce, and malnourishment among both soldiers and civilians made transmission of the disease that much more easy. And once the scale of the outbreak became clear, sick soldiers were herded together onto trains and forced into crowded hospital camps, where the disease could fester and spread even more rapidly. By the time the dust had settled, some 75 million people around the world had lost their lives to the Spanish flu.
The morgues were packed almost to the ceiling with bodies stacked one on top of another. The morticians were day and night. You could never turn around without seeing a big red truck loaded with caskets for the train station so bodies could be sent home.
Though the Spanish flu itself is considered by many to be something like a forgotten pandemic, thanks to the fact that it was strongly overshadowed by the events of World War I, the scenes of devastation birthed from this epidemic have haunted our collective memories for the last century. Even in areas where the actual number of deaths was low, the rate of infection was aggressive enough to leave permanent scars. Towns were forced to close down schools and government buildings, and shopkeepers kept their doors bolted tight. Hospital workers were unable to care for the sick, and there weren't nearly enough grave diggers to care for the dead, leaving bodies to pile up in the streets. A dark mirror to the worst days of the Black Death. And once more, the technology of the industrial age became tangled up in these horrors. Trains and trucks transported huge numbers of corpses for internment, and giant steam shovels were developed to dig out mass graves. These ghastly images, these scenes of pure horror, would last a profound impact on the artists of the era and on humanity's collective imagination. Because throughout history, and with the Spanish flu in particular, disease and plague has always given rise to folklore and legends of dark monsters and even darker magic. For all of recorded history, plagues and diseases have been intimately connected to humanity's fear of monsters and the occult. For ancient and medieval humanity, a plague was an event that was positively mythological in nature, an act of terrible and random destruction caused by fickle and malicious gods. Plagues feature prominently in some of the earliest stories recorded. In Greek mythology, the arrows of Apollo and his twin sister Artemis were said to be responsible for sudden mass outbreaks of disease. The capricious cruelty of the gods made manifest. Pandemics also appear in Christian mythology. In the book of Revelations, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is named Pestilence, so called for the plagues he will bring in his wake during the final days of humanity.
During those days, people will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. Book of Revelation, chapter 9, verse 6.
And these biblical fears were then literalized in the form of giant lizards, basilisks, and dragons. Many reptiles are carriers of bacteria like Clostridium and Salmonella, generally harmless to the lizard host, but positively deadly for humans. So it was no great leap for dragons to become the embodiment of the wanton destruction visited by a plague or similar natural disasters. It devours livestock, it raids villages, and it ravages the countryside. And the only thing left in its wake is a pile of burned corpses. It's no coincidence that worm, the most common Old English word for dragon, was also a synonym for the carrion worms that feasted on the sick and the dead. Dragons appear in many European tales and legends, but perhaps the most famous and enduring depiction is on a national flag that is still flown to this day, the flag of Wales. In the medieval Romans, Lud and Apelles, 2 warring dragons bring plague and devastation to the Isle of Britain. The red dragon representing the Welsh, and the white dragon representing the Anglo-Saxons. The cries and shrieks of these creatures were so powerful, they echoed across the countryside and cast a pall of plague across the land.
Men lost their hue and their strength. Women lost their children. Young men and the maidens lost their senses, and all the animals and trees, and the earth and the waters were left barren.
In myth and folklore, plagues have also appeared in forms that are a little more familiar. Witches, warlocks, and other practitioners of the occult. With only a rudimentary understanding of biology and the natural world, pre-modern humans were quick to assign magical superstitions to all kinds of unwellness. Early Christians and pagans alike believed that dark forces were always lying in wait, ready to inflict pain and suffering at a moment's notice. Insomnia and sleepwalking were believed to be the result of occult forces, either through the dark designs of a magician or through literal possession by a demon. The hallucinations and mental instability brought on by intense fevers were similarly dubbed an affliction of the devil, and were believed to be the result of dark magics entering the human body. It was believed that, in exchange for their occult power, witches and warlocks had to sell their souls and allow their bodies to become vessels for demons and dark forces. As hosts for unclean spirits, the very act of practicing black magic brought with it disease and plague. And this relationship between magic and the spread of disease is similarly rooted in the many ancient mysteries surrounding the occult. For anthropologists of early humanity, the word witchcraft doesn't necessarily refer to pointy black hats, cauldrons, and broomsticks. Witchcraft can also be the very aura and atmosphere that surrounds someone who is in tune with the invisible magical energies of the universe. In this context, witchcraft is the ability of these gifted individuals to literally impose their will on others, to use their feelings of wrath, jealousy, bitterness, and spite as a weapon that infects their victim and causes them to suffer physically. In other words, to inflict a plague. While occult magic and dragons are considered to be mere legends these days, the human fascination with disease has endured well into the present. Indeed, the most well-known monster in pop culture today is probably the zombie, a perfect encapsulation of our fears of bodily contamination and the devastation that pandemics can wreak on society. We can also see our ancient fears of disease given new life in the body horror genre. Violations and mutilations of the human shell play on the same primal anxieties as the plague. The fear of losing control of ourselves, our bodies invaded and subverted by a monstrous force that is beyond our influence. Maybe one of the most intelligent works of fiction with the subject of pandemic diseases is Pathologic, the 2005 open-world survival adventure by Ice Big Lodge. It thrusts the player into a remote city in the Russian tundra that falls victim to a faceless, merciless, and truly unvanquishable foe. The spread of a highly contagious disease that decimates the population and lets the players face an overwhelming avalanche of problems that such a crisis evokes. Superstition erupting and fear breaking out among the populace, political intrigue and subterfuge among the powers that be, fueled by the instability of the situation, and the town suffocated by a debilitating mass panic and hysteria. And although the players can choose between three completely different character archetypes that all experience the events from their very own distinct, but ultimately futile point of view, the true strength of Pathologic's non-linear storytelling is how it manages to render the plague itself this ungraspable catastrophe of seminal proportions, a villain that utters no word and can never be confronted in a conversation or confrontation. Pathologic makes this the actual central figure, the true protagonist and antagonist of the story. It lets us experience firsthand how people in dire times, when facing a hopeless and deadly threat like a devastating pandemic that is too eclectic to make sense of, turn to superstition, occultism, and myth in order to give their worst fears an actual face. How, when it is too hard to bear, fact gets rejected and replaced with fiction in order to cope with a hopeless situation. Pathology gives the player a literal front-row seat during the birth of mythology, the anthropomorphic conception in utero of a monster, one of flesh and blood, that embodies the debilitating fear such a pandemic strikes in the hearts of its victims. A monster created not unlike it used to be with one of our ultimate representatives of these ancient fears surrounding pandemic diseases. The vampire. Cultures all around the world maintain legends about creatures that drain the blood of the living. Some hold that vampires are sorrowful and solitary creatures that forego contact with the outside world, eternally tortured by their desire for blood. Others see vampires as apex predators that relish their midnight hunts, whether for food or sport. But however you look at it, the modern incarnation of the bloodsucker is intimately linked to our fears of plague and disease. Vampirism is literally a disease spread through infection. A bite from a vampire infects its victim, causing them to lose control of themselves and be slowly transformed into an undead creature of the night themselves. Bram Stoker's famous novel Dracula, the proverbial Bible of vampire lore, touches on many of these themes. In the epistolary novel, Dracula's predation causes his victims to waste away and lose their minds, just like the plagues that haunted the nightmares of the people in those days. But ultimately, it was Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau's 1922 film Nosferatu, itself a plagiarism of Stoker's Dracula, that cemented this connection between vampires and disease. The titular vampire of Nosferatu is a pale, elegant, and emaciated figure, with deep-set eyes and spidery limbs. It's a picture-perfect depiction of a plague victim, and at the same time, the archetypal vampire. In the story of Nosferatu, the vampire Count Orlok arrives by ship in the fictional German town of Visborg, arriving with him a small army of rats, which brings plague and disease to the hapless village. Stoker's estate sued Murnau for plagiarizing Dracula and ultimately won in court. Murnau was ordered to destroy all copies of Nosferatu, but a handful of reels survived, and the film has endured as a highly influential masterpiece of early cinema, and as one of the first and greatest horror films ever made. It's also in the public domain, so you can actually go watch it on YouTube right now. And this connection between vampires and disease survived with it. Nosferatu was so influential that the official 1931 film adaptation of Dracula even absorbed this detail about the plague into its story. When you consider the era in which these movies were created, mere years after the end of the devastating Spanish flu, this link between vampirism and sickness becomes even more apparent. Europe had just been scarred by the bloody battles of World War I, and at the same time, the Spanish flu had decimated the population of almost every country on the continent, leaving behind scenes of horror in every village and city. And in turn, a grim figure arose from the ruins of Europe and beheld the continent cowering in fear of the vampire and its plague. Today, the zombie is, in many ways, the modern spin-off of the vampire, a reflection of our anxieties over the fragility of our physical shell, of our world, and over how quickly the things we've built can come crashing down. Ever since the smash success of Danny Boyle's 2002 masterpiece 28 Days Later, zombies have become a permanent fixture in pop culture again. And for the last 7 years, The Walking Dead has been the most watched television show in the world.
Sucks, don't it?
At the same time, video games like Bloodborne have also carried this pandemic torch into the modern era. This 2015 action RPG from Software is a masterful depiction of a society afflicted by a monstrous plague in the throes of collapse.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open. Fear the old blood.
And in the recently released Vampire from Dontnod Studios, this mythological connection between the fear of a deadly pandemic and vampirism is depicted in an even more literal way. The player assumes the role of a World War I military doctor who returns to England in 1918 to find the country gripped by the Spanish flu. And amidst this tableau of death and devastation rises an even darker plague: vampirism. It is the tale of the modern vampire made literal, along with its tangled web of connections to disease, war, and social collapse. In the 1947 novel La Peste by the French existentialist, philosopher, and writer Albert Camus, the Algerian coastal town of Oran becomes afflicted by a deadly pandemic, a new outbreak of the bubonic plague. As the town's population, and among them the story's central characters, struggle to survive and maintain their humanity in the face of this unforgiving catastrophe, they come face to face with the cruelty and viciousness that humans are capable of in dog-eat-dog times like these. The world had just breathed a sigh of relief with the conclusion of World War II and the defeat of fascism in Europe. The Allied nations gave out cheers of victory and proudly vowed, never again. But Camus, who himself had fought in the French resistance for many years during the Nazi occupation of France, he understood that these dark undercurrents, war, famine, disease, authoritarianism, they're not so easily banished. Those eternally recurring banes of humankind, they always lie in wait, just out of sight, always lurking, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike again. The plague will return, as it always does. It's not a matter of if, only of when. Thank you so much for watching. Producing Monsters of the Week takes an enormous amount of time, effort, and resources, especially for a one-man operation like my channel. So if you'd like to see more, why not consider joining my Patreon campaign to support my work there? You can follow the link in the description or click the card that just popped up in the top right. It helps out massively, and I'm really thankful to all the people who already support me there. And a special shout out this month goes out to these top tier supporters: Arcel Markussen, Quentin Prodhomme, Thwagam, Chuck Taylor, Nicolas Soros-Apuch, Evan Tekre, Kiris Darhaku, Murak Sardis, Ten of Spades, Chen Wei, Morgan Zickles, Cameron Richter, Micha Nestla, Rok Sakrajek, Susanna Maria, Dominic Hitai Bako, Adam Burr, Vladimir Baciu, Kaspar Ram, Sholek, Andrei Kryakushin, Jonathan Irwin, Adriel Garcia, Liam Jones, Lucas, James Lynch, Cleish Hiei, Vida Daly, Nick Lazelle, Malin, Matt Davis, Yulia, David Nadeau, The Melting Squad, Sean Quigley, Angrim, Roman Vasenmüller, Nathan DeGrand, Alex Lake, Carlos Spilari, Siriagneth Eliasson, Agustin Ortega, Maxwell Brown, Max Herbert, Bruzov Jones, David Zelenak, Karl Jura, Martin Schmidt, Brian Vieira, Adam Cross, Michael Spina IV, Dennis Pfefferkorn, Mr. Bergadon, Mido Reno, Pascal Failing, Milan Vujnovic, Sebastian Garcia, and Jacob Woodward. Until next time, ta-ta!